Paris. The year is 2026. The French Empire still stands. The most powerful nation in Europe. For more than 2 centuries, France shaped the future of Europe, but Britain never became the world's dominant power. It all came down to a single day. June 18th, 1815. On the fields of Waterloo, the future of Europe hung in the balance. Everything came down to one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. On this battlefield, he would either lose everything or change history forever. In reality, Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, defeated by the combined forces of Britain and Prussia. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died 6 years later. Napoleon's defeat changed far more than his own fate. Across Europe, the empire he had built began to unravel. As France's influence faded, Europe's greatest powers gathered in Vienna, determined to redraw the map of Europe and restore the balance of power. For generations, Waterloo was remembered as the battle that ended Napoleon's story and shaped the future of Europe. But what if Napoleon had won? June 18th, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo had already raged for hours. Across the battlefield, more than 140,000 soldiers were fighting for the future of Europe. Napoleon commanded around 72,000 French troops. Facing him stood the Duke of Wellington, leading a multinational army of nearly 68,000 soldiers. To the east, Field Marshal Blücher was marching toward Waterloo with nearly 50,000 Prussian soldiers. If they reached Wellington, France would be forced to fight 2 armies at once. For Napoleon, every passing minute brought disaster closer. In our history, the Prussians arrived just in time. Their arrival sealed Napoleon's defeat. Dark clouds gathered over Waterloo. Then the rain began to fall. Far to the east, the sound of cannon fire echoed. In our history, 33,000 French soldiers continued their pursuit of the Prussian army. But this time, everything changed. A new order was sent. Leave the Prussians. March toward Waterloo. The message finally reached Cauchy. Its orders were unmistakable. Abandon the pursuit. Turn toward Waterloo. The order spread through the ranks. One by one, the columns began to turn. Now everything was different. 2 French armies were converging on Waterloo. The march had begun. With every mile, the balance began to shift. Hours into the battle, neither side had broken. The struggle continued, relentless, unforgiving, and undecided. Wellington believed his army could still hold the line. He saw a battlefield under control. But beyond the smoke, history was already changing. Napoleon kept watching. Through the rain, through the smoke, he saw them. At last, Grouchy had arrived. 33,000 fresh French soldiers were marching toward Waterloo, exactly where he had hoped. History had changed. There was no turning back. Across the horizon, they kept coming, rank after rank, through the rain. Wellington understood. The battle had changed, and there was nothing he could do. They just kept coming, rank after rank. Neither side moved. Both armies waited. The next command would decide the future of Europe. Silence was over. Napoleon gave the order. The French army advanced. Nothing could stop them now. Then came the first volley. But they kept coming. The French had endured the first volley. Now they answered. The British line still stood, but every volley came at a terrible cost. With every step, the French tightened their grip, and the British line had nowhere left to yield. The British line finally broke. By morning, the battlefield had fallen silent. The French had won, but victory came at a terrible cost. The news of Waterloo did not remain on the battlefield. Within days, the message began to spread across Europe. For the governments of Europe, the news was deeply unsettling. Napoleon had not been defeated. He had returned to the center of European power. The balance of power was changing, and this time, Europe would have to adapt to Napoleon. But the victory at Waterloo was only the beginning. Napoleon had defeated Wellington before the Prussians could arrive. Now, across Europe, governments were forced to confront a new reality. Napoleon Bonaparte was still in power. But Napoleon and his generals were already preparing for what came next. Across Europe, new alliances were beginning to take shape. The news reached Britain. Napoleon had not been defeated. He had returned. And soon, the news began to spread. Across Britain, people learned that Napoleon had won. Across Europe, the news spread quickly. Napoleon had won, and Britain now faced a new reality. France was no longer simply a rival, it was becoming the dominant power on the continent. The battlefield was behind him. Now came the far greater challenge. What would he do with the power he had gained? Europe was waiting, and Napoleon was about to reshape it. His victory did more than end a war. It shattered the old order and opened the door to a new one. Across Europe, kings and empires were forced to accept a reality they did not choose. The balance of power was no longer in their hands. Europe had entered a new political reality. The powers that once sought to contain France now had to negotiate with it. Treaties were rewritten, alliances shifted, and across the continent, a new balance of power was taking shape. The victory had changed more than a single battle. It had changed the future of Europe. And from the streets of Paris, a new chapter in history was beginning. But history did not stop in 1815. For the next 2 centuries, the world would follow a different path. And now we arrive in 2026. But what did that world become? Paris, 2026. More than 2 centuries later, French influence can still be seen across Europe. From the Atlantic coast, deep into the heart of Europe. By 2026, France stood at the heart of a European system shaped by its influence. Not through conquest alone, but through decades of political, economic, and cultural influence. But France did not need to rule Europe directly. Its influence reached far beyond its own borders through alliances, trade, institutions, and diplomacy. And over time, those connections became part of everyday life. People, goods, and ideas moved freely across the continent, bringing Europe closer together. But France's influence did not stop at borders. By 2026, French had become part of everyday life, the language of stations, schools, business, and public life. For millions, it was no longer simply a foreign language. It was simply normal. And the influence reached even deeper. Children grew up learning in French, its language, its history, and the ideas that shaped the continent. For a new generation, this was not foreign history. It was their history. And that influence followed them into adulthood. French had become the language of business and professional life. For millions of Europeans, speaking French was no longer a sign of foreign influence. It was simply part of doing business. Over time, the borders between cultures began to blur. French customs mixed with local traditions, creating something new. Europe was thriving. But beneath its prosperity, tensions were rising. Then came 1914. In 1914, Europe went to war. An assassination in Sarajevo triggered a chain reaction of alliances, drawing the great powers into the First World War. But this time, the war ended differently. France emerged as the dominant power, and the peace that followed created a very different Europe. Germany was treated differently, and the tensions that once pushed Europe toward another war never reached the same point. As a result, the Second World War never happened, and without it, Europe developed along a completely different path. With France at its center, Europe was changing faster than ever. Industry-connected nations that had once stood apart, and borders became less important to everyday trade. New partnerships reshaped the continent, and gradually, Europe began to look very different from the world we know today. And so, by 2026, this was no longer an alternate history. It was simply the world people knew. France had become a dominant power in Europe. Borders, alliances, and nations had taken a different path. The First World War had changed. The Second World War never came, and Europe became something entirely different. But none of this started in 1914. It began much earlier, with one battle, one victory, Waterloo.